Hello and welcome to Conversing the Classics, a Classical Youth Society of Ireland podcast dedicated to discussing classics with the subject's experts. My name's Oscar McHale and I'm the founder and chair of CYSI. Today's topic is the Roman poet, known best for his epic poem narrating the journey of the Trojan hero Aeneas to the shores of Latium and his quest to find what will one day become Rome. Here to discuss the life, times and legacy of Vergil is Charlie Kerrigan, a PhD student in TCD, whose thesis is entitled Reading Vergil in Britain, 1870 to 1930. Charlie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, choosing a topic for your thesis, I can't imagine is an easy task, something that you're going to spend 4 years of your life solely looking at. What made you decide you wanted to spend the next 4 or so years with the work of Vergil?
I really just followed what I like. I did him as an undergraduate option in my undergraduate course, and I liked what I read. He's one of my favourites in terms of Latin authors. And I thought that was a good basis for choosing a PhD topic, because you're going to have to spend 4 years with the guy, so you want to make sure that you don't get sick of each other.
Yeah.
And so far, so good. Yeah, it's going well.
And I suppose then moving in, just a bit of background about Vergil as a person. What do we know about his early life?
So that's a good question. We don't know a huge amount about his life. Like a lot of classical poets, we have sort of scraps of information, but we don't have a huge amount. There's an ancient biography which dates from the 4th century AD.
So about a few hundred years after
Exactly,
his death,
yeah. And we think that that's based on a life by Suetonius, which is still about 100 years after Vergil dies. And apart from the poems themselves, this is really the source of our information about Vergil. And the story is that he was born in Mantua in the north of Italy in 70 BC. Okay, so we're pretty sure about stuff like that.
Yeah.
He's from a farming background. He is not from the capital, that's important. He comes to Rome, meets important people, he meets the right sort of people, and they sponsor him, and he is then able to write his poems.
Yeah. Now, in terms of his education, do we know anything about how he was educated or by whom?
So the question there is, how much do you trust the biography? So the biography, I think, has a few sentences about how he was educated in places like Cremona and Milan, and then he went to Naples, where he learned philosophy, and that's sort of the bare bones of what we know about his education.
Now, he's born in Mantua, which is a part of the Roman province of Italy. At the time, why does he decide to make the move to Rome? Do we know?
Well, there's a story here again. The important thing is that Mantua is in the north of Italy. It's not quite, it's very recent sort of Roman acquisition. It's Roman, but it's just barely Roman. So the story is that so we have to do a bit of background here. There's a Roman civil war, okay? And Octavian, or Caesar, or Augustus as he's later called, he wins the civil war, and then there are land redistributions, okay? So the veterans need land to farm, and land is appropriated in North Italy to give to soldiers. The story is that Vergil's farm is one of those places of land that is reappropriated, and Vergil loses his farm. And there's a story that he has to, this soldier comes to get him off his land, and he has to jump into the river to escape this soldier, and he sort of escapes from humanity. And then what happens is he petitions influential people in the circle of Augustus, and they bring him to Rome. This is all sort of speculation, but he impresses at Rome. He's recognized as a poetic talent, and then Augustus becomes his patron, or that's the story. The sort of the social circle in Rome allow him to write his poetry, and he sort of makes a life for himself in that arena.
And approximately when does he write his first major piece of work, and do we know what it's about?
Yeah, so his first major piece of work is called the Eclogues. They are 10 short poems, and they appear, the dates are a bit sketchy, but they appear in the early 30s BC. Okay, so between, say, 40 and 35 BC, which is just after the end. It's not even at the end of the Roman Civil Wars, so things are very uncertain. Julius Caesar assassinated in 44. So,
and do we know if his ties, if he was involved in the Caesarian party prior to meeting Octavian, or had ties?
We don't, and this is a question that goes right through Vergil's whole career and through his subsequent history. Is, how involved was he with Augustus? Was he of a particular party or not? We don't know, and people have inferred different things from his poetry, saying that he's pro-Augustus or he's anti-Augustus, and really that's too simple to make him an either or. But we sort of look down on the idea of a poet being patronized by a patron, but this was a matter of just earning your way. You know, people like Shakespeare and Dryden and later poets, they rely on a patron and they sort of send them flowery letters to let them know how great they are. But that's just the reality of making poetry. But to get back to the eclogues are 10 short poems. They're in this genre of pastoral poetry. So this is a genre about shepherds and their lives. And Vergil is following a Greek guy called Theocritus. That's where he gets his inspiration from. But then what happens is Vergil writes these pastoral poems, and these poems, this is his first work, remember, these become hugely influential for later pastoral poetry. So there's a massive European tradition of pastoral and pastoralism in art and literature, and the eclogues are a real huge part of that. They're 10 short poems. They're quite difficult and they're quite sort of strange. They're full of all these references to different things. They're hugely influenced by Greek poetry, by the poetry of Alexandria in the Hellenistic era, so about 200 years before Vergil is writing. But what he does is he takes this form of sort of very highly stylized poetry, but he fills it with full of contemporary references to Rome, to the Civil War. 2 of these poems have references to the land confiscations and the Civil War, Poem 1 and Poem 9. Poem 4 is particularly interesting because in this poem he tells about the birth of a son to the Roman consul at the time, Pollio. And then once the Christian era comes in, you can imagine what the early Christians made of this. This is Vergil predicting that a son is going to be born. He will bring back the golden age.
Someone tried to make him a saint at one point, didn't they?
Yeah, so there's this whole, and he was a magician in the Middle Ages and medieval Naples and stuff. So, but one of these great sort of themes in the Vergilian tradition after he dies is that he's a Christian, or he predicts the Christian world. And medieval Christian Europe makes a big deal of this. And if you want to fit the two together, it's pretty uncanny because he's saying this boy will bring back the good times.
But he's probably talking about Augustus.
He's not talking about Augustus. I think he's talking about this newborn son of his friend.
Oh,
so it's not even that big a deal.
And what does the newborn son of his friend go on to do?
I don't know that, but I don't think we know much. I think maybe the identification of who this child is uncertain. It's just
So he wasn't a prophet. He was definitely a poet.
He was definitely. He just calls him puer, a boy. So yeah, but it's a nice example of how people read what they want. You know, how people read Vergil.
Yeah.
All these amazing directions that people take him in.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, obviously, his career starts when he's commissioned by Augustus to write his epic poem, the Aeneid, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But how does he actually do we know even, how does he come to meet Augustus?
There's no sort of record of, the first meeting or sort of, him knocking on the door. But as I said, it's a question of Vergil being in the sort of circle at Rome of poets and patrons, and he's introduced to Augustus, I think via Maecenas, but I'm not sure about this, who was a colleague or a minister of Augustus's, and he meets him. And we know stuff like, so when Octavian gets back from the Battle of Actium, which is in 31 BC, when he returns to Italy in 29 BC, we're told, the story is that Vergil reads the Georgics to him over 4 days in Atella in Italy. So we do have these sort of intriguing snippets of detail, but we don't have sort of the collected letters of Vergil. We don't have sort of.
But do we have any sort of correspondence between Vergil and the imperial?
There's a letter that is preserved in a sort of a late antique source. A guy called Macrobius who writes this big work full of references to Vergil, and he quotes a letter, just a fragment of a letter. I'm not sure of the content, but it's deferential. It's saying, "You're asking for my poem, but it's not ready. It's not good enough yet."
Yeah.
So, and again, it's a question of how much credit you want to assign to that biography. So in the Victorian period, people read his biography, and as you would, they just say, this is the story of his life. In modern times, criticism is much more serious, and it says, well, how do we believe this? Do we believe these stories? But there is that snippet of a letter.
Yeah. Now, his second work, the Georgics, is something that you were focusing quite a bit about in your research. Tell us a little bit about the Georgics, what it's about, when he writes it.
Yeah, so Vergil writes, or he's famous for 3 big poems, we've talked about the eclogues. You mentioned the Aeneid, which is his sort of his most famous work. His middle poem is a poem called the Georgics, which is, again, a really sort of original and interesting work. So the first thing is, it has a strange name to our ears, but Georgos is just the Greek word for farmer, so it's just, you could call it, I don't know.
But all his works are in Latin.
All his works are in Latin, yeah, but he's influenced by Greece, so the title is Greek. And you could just call it farming, or it's a poem about farming. And it's 4 books. It's about 2,000 lines long. It's in hexameters, which is the meter that he writes in. And it's about how to run your farm. So he takes on this persona of the the teacher, and he teaches his pupil, which is you, the reader, how to care for your crops, how to look after bees, how to raise your cattle, how to prepare your farmland, how to know when the storm is coming.
Which must be quite an interesting source. I mean, if you want to look at actually it in context, that he's writing the perfect sort of farmer's guide.
Yeah, and it's not the first subject you think of for a poem, right? So we do have agricultural treatises from Rome in prose about how to run your farm, and Vergil takes this sort of seemingly unpoetic subject and he makes his poem out of it, and he talks about agriculture in a way which I don't think anyone has managed since to talk so well in a poem about agriculture. But the point is, it's not just about the subject, right? So it's about agriculture, but it also talks about the big themes that we like to read about in poetry. So it talks about war and peace and love and death. It's very rooted in its contemporary context. So Vergil is living in a post-war society. There's been decades of civil war in Rome, and he's reflecting on that. Land, if you think about it, it's a very sort of intriguing theme, right? It incorporates war and land use, the land confiscations. So it's a poem about farming, but it's really about lots else too. Yeah.
Now we mentioned earlier on that he's sort of probably his most famous work is the Aeneid. How does he come to be chosen to write Rome's great epic? I mean, there's so many poets like Ovid, Propertius, Catullus knocking around Rome at this time. Why of all people, and especially considering some of what he's written doesn't seem like he'd be necessarily the first choice for epic poem, why is it that he's chosen?
That's a great question, and I don't think we have an answer. The first thing I'd say is this word chosen. So we don't know whether it was a choice or whether it was, we know that he's in Augustus' circle, and that I think in one of the biographies it says he writes the poem at the request of Augustus. Yeah. So Augustus says to him, look, write me an epic, and Vergil says, okay, fine. Yeah. And you can interpret that in lots of ways. You can say, as people have, Vergil is just sort of, he's no good because he's just placating this emperor and he's writing in this poem. The main thing to stress here is that the biographical detail is so sketchy that we don't know the circumstances too well of how he writes this. He's one of the leading poets. I mean, after the Georgics, he's a big name, and he mentions in the Georgics that he's going to write this poem. Yeah. So it becomes clear that he's going to be the guy to write it, but we're just not sure of the sort of the precise details.
But I mean, in terms, this is sort of going off the rails a bit here, but I mean, in terms of the Aeneid, it is very obviously propaganda driven. I mean, there's so many references to saying this coming of the great Augustus and this great line of Iulus. Surely there obviously was sort of some influence from the imperial court at the time to say, you should add this or add this. Well, that would be my interpretation. I could be totally wrong.
You're right in the sense that there was an imperial quote unquote influence in that he's writing for this guy. So yes, that's right. Propaganda is a dangerous word. So a lot of people take that view. They say, look, this poem is great, but it's just propaganda, and he's propping up Augustus, and there are passages in the poem, the end of book 6. There's a bit in book 1 where Jupiter says that he will give empire without end to the Romans. There's a famous passage in book 8 where he's really glorifying Augustus' achievements, and that comes close to what we would call propaganda. But the great thing about the Aeneid is that there is so much in it, and there are so many moments in the poem where really that whole sort of position of praise and support is really turned on its head completely. And a lot of academic scholarship in the last few decades has swung the complete opposite way. Yeah. They've said, yes, there are passages here, but let's not read too much into them. There are magnificent passages in the poem, particularly its ending, where this Roman hero who, if you want to see him as Augustus, he ends the poem by doing the one thing he was told to avoid, which is killing this man in anger. Killing his rival in anger, killing Turnus. So, how much do you make of the poem itself? And is it propaganda? Could Vergil be being ironic? Could there be moments where he's saying things he's not believing them? Who says what in the poem? Does that influence what we think about it? So, sort of a common view is that it's glorifying the imperial regime. But the wonderful thing about the poem is that it's really not so simple. Yeah. And if any, it's a great poem for resisting what you want it to be. So you think, oh, it's this, I've got it, I've cracked it. Yeah. and then you read another passage, you're like, well, actually, hold on now. This
is contradictory.
And that's what makes it, I think. I mean, if you want any sort of qualification for being a great poem, that's one of them. You know, it makes you think and rethink, and it never lets you have your own way.
Yeah, I mean, definitely what attracted me to it first, reading it through, not so much, I do think the poem's great, and I do think the themes are great, and it is very interesting, but definitely the political subtext, I think, is fascinating. When you look at all these little references that, obviously, as you said, we don't know if he was told to write them in, and if someone was looking over his shoulder as he wrote it, but it is very, very interesting to think, oh, you know, there is some sort of political context here, that he obviously was a fan of Augustus, or he had to be.
Well, there are people who would say he definitely wasn't a fan, but
well, we're going to come to sort of his death in a minute, and
right, okay. But no, that's a valid viewpoint, and yeah, you're right. The political context is fascinating, and that's something that we don't have, for instance, say in Homer. We have the lyric poems, but we know that Vergil was in this group of people, and we know that the Emperor Augustus had just stopped this very bloody civil war. Yeah. So from a historical point of view, it's pretty juicy.
Yeah.
But you know, the context is not just the last 10 years. Vergil, he is very good at incorporating the history of Italy, the Italian peninsula, which only became quote unquote Roman in the early 1st century. So just about a few years before he was born. In book 7 of the poem, there's this catalogue of Italian peoples.
Yeah.
Vergil is not a Roman. He's not sort of born and bred in the city of Rome. So there are layers and layers of political interpretations, and you're right, it makes it very interesting.
It could be a subject that we could spend the entire podcast focusing on, but
exactly.
Obviously there's lots. We are just sort of giving an introduction here. I suppose you mentioned Homer there. Homer is a profound influence in many ways. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Homer is the ostensible model for this poem. So Homer writes these two great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They've been called like the Bible of the Roman world, as in these texts that you read and absorb and live your life by. We know that we can tell that Vergil was a really excellent reader of Homer, that he knew his Homer backwards.
Because he uses a lot of the similar...
because the whole thing is steeped. The form of the poem, it's an epic poem.
Yeah.
The subject matter of the poem, it's the first half of the Aeneid, it's about travelling and wandering and getting to Italy.
Yeah.
The second half of the poem is about battle and warfare, so you've that Odyssey inspired half and the Iliad inspired half.
And he states in the invocation of the muse, Arma wormque cano, arms in the man I sing, arms being Achilles in the Iliad, the man supposedly supposed to be Odysseus. He's telling us from the get-go.
Exactly. But again, it's so subtle, it works on several different levels. So yes, he gives us these big clues, but even in the language he uses, so he is adapting Latin language, he's adapting the Latin language to Homeric form, so phrases, vocabulary,
and he writes in the same meter, doesn't he?
He writes in the same meter, similes, so the whole thing is really steeped in Homer and Homeric epic, and it's one of the great instances of a poet being inspired by someone or some poet and really doing something really exciting with it. So you're right, Homer is everywhere in Vergil.
Now, obviously undertaking the writing of an epic poem is no small task. How long roughly does he spend?
So he spends 10 years writing the poem, which is a long time. So from 29 BC roughly to about 19 BC when he dies when the poem is still unfinished. But again, if we look to the stories that are associated with Vergil, he's a famously slow writer. So the story is that he gets up in the morning and he composes a line or two, and then he spends the whole day paring them down, refining them, making them perfect. So he writes, the Aeneid is 12 books. It must be it's over 10,000 lines long. So is that slow going? I suppose it is pretty slow going.
Yeah.
But
you wouldn't want to be doing it with your thesis.
Exactly. Well, that's precisely. But he has this reputation for being very methodical, for every line is well worked. He's famous for his style, for the Latin hexameters he uses. Really, everything fits perfectly, and so.
And there's great. I suppose not everyone listening will have read the Aeneid, but I would urge, and I'm sure Charlie would as well, to go and read it. It is this magnificent piece of work, and it is, as you said, beautifully crafted. Everything fits together so well and flows. funnily, he spends 10 years writing this. We talked about the political context, whether it's not clear whether or not he wrote it with with Augustus over his shoulder saying, remove that, put that in.
Right.
But there is a story that on his deathbed,
Yeah.
he said, burn the Aeneid.
Yeah. So
What do you think, how would you receive that?
it's an incredible story. I mean, and we were talking about political context, like what a story for someone's biography in the political context. So what happens is the story again is that he's in 19 BC. He goes to Greece with Augustus to, get some research done. The Aeneid is almost finished. He wants to finish it off, get some inspiration in Greece or whatever. He falls sick in Greece, and he returns to Italy early, and he dies at Brundisium, this port which is Brindisi in modern Italy, and he dies there, having just reached Italy. And the story is that when on his way back, he said to his two friends, "Look, burn this. It's not finished, and I don't want it to get out." And then the story is that when he died, Augustus sort of stepped in and said, "Look, there's no way you're burning that. This is too important." So it's edited and it's put out, and it's published. It's unfinished. So there are lines in the Aeneid which are only half completed.
Yeah.
So you look at it two ways. You can look at it saying, this guy is such a perfectionist that he had spent his whole 10 years working on this thing, and then he was like, it's not perfect, get rid of it.
Yeah.
And you think, well, that's impossible. Or you could look at it and saying, he could be thinking he's dying, and he thinks, what have I done?
Yeah.
I've written this poem in praise of this tyrant. And this is really a sort of a view that's very strong in the 20th century.
Yeah.
At the end of the 20th century, which says, what have I, this is not good. And he says, burn the thing.
Yeah.
And if anyone's interested in following up the story, there's a novel by an Austrian guy called Hermann Brock, which is published in 1945, called The Death of Vergil, which is...
Yeah, I'll put a link to it on Amazon in the description.
Yeah, and that has the whole context of the Second World War and fascism and sort of the power of leaders. So, again, it's this sort of remarkable story, and you sort of have to decide what you want to do with it and how you want to take it. But
and personally, how do you think? Why do you think he said it? If he did, I mean...
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe an element of both, that it wasn't finished, so he didn't want it out, and part of he would like to believe that he thought, that passage in Book 8 where I'm praising Augustus and acting him, that people will, I don't want that out. But it's really an open question, and it has to stay an open question, because we just don't know, we just don't know.
But obviously, against his will, it goes ahead and it's published, and there's nothing he can do about it. How is it received in Rome, not just in the first century, but I mean, it lasts a very long time. So it is seen as the piece of Roman literature.
Yeah,
how's it received?
It's the literary event of the century, of the era, right? So Propertius, his fellow poet, he has this poem where he says, before the Aeneid is published, he gets excited. He says, "Look, this poem is going to be better than the Iliad. It's Vergil is actually." He's actually doing it, there's a sense of excitement. This guy is actually taking on Homer head on, and he's going to write this Roman epic. It's published, and what seems to happen is that it immediately becomes a school text. So it's put on the Leaving Cert, and it's put on the Junior Cert, and that so from the very moment it's published, it's a canonical poem. There's graffiti in Pompeii, which has quotes from the Aeneid, and then that's the start of this massive tradition of the afterlife of the poem.
Yeah.
But from what we can tell, it's a big hit, and it goes down very well. Yeah.
And I actually, just something that has sprung to mind, in terms of actually his writing of it, most wealthy Romans at the time, correct me if I'm wrong, spoke Greek. They would have spoken Greek to each other.
Yeah, I think Greek would have been a sort of a language, but I think they would have spoken Latin.
They would have spoken Latin to each other.
And then Greek was sort of something you maybe said if you spoke with friends.
Yeah.
But Vergil would have been known Greek.
Does he write it in Latin for the sense of patriotism? To say, look, this is definitely Roman's epic. I'm not letting the Greeks take this away.
Yeah, so he's part of the whole era of Latin poetry. So Catullus, who is sort of 80 to 50 BC.
Yeah. Horace,
who's Vergil's contemporary. It's a whole cultural moment where these poets are saying, look, we're going to take these Greek poems and these Greek meters, and we're going to make them into Latin. So we're going to give the Latin language its own sort of its own voice. And Horace and Catullus and Vergil, they all are proud of doing this.
And another thing that's I want to bring up about the Aeneid and just get your opinion on it. It's quite an anti-Greek text, and it's interesting that he chooses to make it. I suppose it obviously wouldn't be pro-Greek, but that it is so blatantly anti-Greek. I mean, Book 2 dictates the fall of Troy, and one image that particularly springs to mind is when Hector, the Trojan hero, comes to Aeneas in a dream.
Yeah.
And in the Iliad, he was covered with the auger of Zeus, so that his body wasn't bashed up. But Virgil describes his body as being torn asunder, and as if the Greeks have defiled this, and then he talks about Ajax's rape of the priestess and things like this.
Yeah.
He really goes to town on the whole, we hate the Greeks. Why do you think he has such a go at this?
Well, I think it's the thing about Virgil that I want to stress here is that, you really can't simplify him, and that's the great thing about him. So if you say, it's a really anti-Greek poem, on a certain level, that's true. On the narrative level, this is a poem about Rome and Italy, and the Greeks are the traditional enemy, and that Book 2 you're talking about is full of, the Greeks are the bad guys. So that's in a sense, it's anti-Greek. But you have to say, is that Virgil saying the Greeks are bad, or is that Virgil telling a story? Who is telling these things? Who is saying these things? And then you have to bear in mind that the poem is steeped. It's a love song to the tradition of Greek poetry. So there's so much influence of Greece and Greek literature that it's probably too simple to say it's an anti-Greek poem. Yeah. But you could say that, the Greeks are in one sense the bad guys of the story.
So I suppose then moving sort of up and past after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, how does Virgil carry on into the Middle Ages, and how is he referenced? Is he used a lot? What happens?
So it's a massive question.
Oh yeah, obviously.
It's really exciting. So as I said, this poem becomes very famous. It survives antiquity. So that's what I mean. A lot of poems don't survive antiquity, but this poem is famous enough and well copied enough in monasteries to survive antiquity. And I think in so many different eras you could go to. There, Virgil is there. So in the Carolingian period, in the sort of high Middle Ages, the 11th, 12th century, the big one I suppose is Dante. Okay, so when Dante is composing his Commedia in the 13th century in Italy, Virgil is his guide in the poem, and he quotes Virgil, and Virgil, he says, is his maestro, his teacher. There are translations of the poem into medieval Irish. Okay.
Oh, so, wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
A translation or a version. I think there's a copy here in the library. In all of these different national literatures, there are people taking Virgil, people using Virgil.
Sorry, just going back to that point about the translation in medieval Irish. Approximately what year or what?
I really don't know. I think it's called something like, and my Irish isn't very good, the Wanderings of Aeneas. Yeah. And I'm not sure if it's a version or if it's a translation, but there was a bardic tradition in Irish poetry. Virgil was a big presence there. Yeah. In the Irish sort of scriptoria. So Virgil it's another aspect of Virgil's story, and then he never sort of goes out of style too completely. He's around in Britain and France in the Renaissance, in the sort of ascendancy period in the 19th century. So he stays relevant.
But I mean, I suppose the Middle Ages were quite dominated by Christianity. How is he received in terms of the fact that he's writing about sort of a polytheistic, we're writing to a polytheistic religion? I mean, is that toyed with at all, or is that sort of shunned?
So the first thing is an interesting point about history is that, our sources are very Christian for the medieval period, and we think of medieval Europe as very Christian, but it probably wasn't as Christian as that. There are the Christian sources, and then, there are people living their lives like they do in every year. But you're right, it's a Christian society for most of medieval Europe, and he's so good that they don't have a problem with him. So he's appropriated that fourth eclogue I mentioned is very important to say this guy was okay. He predicted the birth of Jesus, and he's a feature. What Dante does is he is a pagan in Dante's sort of theological universe. So he guides Dante through the first two parts of his poem, through Inferno and Purgatorio, and then what happens at the end of Purgatorio, Virgil vanishes because Virgil is not a Christian. So Virgil can't get into heaven, and there's this great moment where Dante sees Beatrice, who will lead him through paradise, and he turns around to his friend Vergil and says, Virgil, look, I'm here, I'm seeing her again. And when he's doing that in the Italian poem, he's actually quoting Virgil. Dante quotes
Okay.
Vergil for the fourth book of the Aeneid. But Vergil vanishes. And Vergil, this is the great moment of the poem, Vergil isn't a Christian.
Yeah.
So the point is, it's this sort of terrible double standard where he's great and we like him, but he's just not a Christian. So he's a sort of this terrible idea of this righteous pagan, you know.
But he was still kept in circulation. He
Of
was
course,
translated, wasn't
yeah, and he never goes out of style, really.
Yeah. Now, moving into, I suppose, your area of focus, when is Vergil first translated into the English as we speak it today?
Yeah, so I'm not sure the specific details of a first translation. I'm sure there are medieval and Renaissance versions, but the version that really is still the most famous version in English is by John Dryden. So we're moving now to England in the 1690s, and Dryden writes this translation of the Aeneid, or translates the Aeneid into the language of his day, so heroic couplets, rhyming heroic couplets.
Yeah.
And it's a version where he's not afraid to, do the poem his own way. So it's not sort of a slavish imitation or translation, but he really makes the poem.
So what kind of changes does he incorporate?
I haven't studied this particular poem a lot, but he puts it in the style of his day, so these heroic couplets.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to make it his own, I
Yeah.
suppose. And then that's the major version in English, for a long time. It's still one of the major versions in English. And that sort of gives the Aeneid some real purchase in English. And then as time goes on, Victorian era and into the modern era, translations proliferate. He was always translated.
This is actually kind of a more personal, again, off the rail question. Do you have a favourite translation of Vergil into English? If everyone had to read one translation, because obviously not everyone's going to learn Latin, read the original thing in Latin.
Yeah.
Which one would you recommend to everyone?
That's a great question. So there are loads of them, and if you've loads of time in your hands, you can search around, but we don't normally have that much time in our hands. There's a version by a guy called Stanley Lombardo, who's an American. It's only a few years old. That's a very good translation.
Yeah.
Because it's very readable. It gives you the feeling of the poem, and I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
There's a great introduction in that volume.
Yeah.
You'll find it on Amazon or wherever.
Again, I'll put it in the description.
Great. So this intro will give you a really great sense of the poem, and then you'll be able to read it and pick bits you like and whatever. So
Yeah.
that's a good starting point. And then if you really love it, you can hunt out your own favorite.
Your own favourite.
Exactly.
Yeah. How is Vergil received by the 19th century audience?
Yeah. So what interests me about this sort of area is the sort of the social context. So we're in Britain now. We're in the 19th century. Okay. So the British Empire is reaching its sort of apex.
Mm-hmm.
Britain is a massive commercial and imperial power in the world. British Navy, British trade, British free trade. And Vergil is still a school text. So in this period, if you're a very wealthy Victorian individual, what do you learn in school? You don't learn science or history or geography, which is what people at the time were saying we should really be learning. You learn Vergil and you learn Greek and Latin. So Vergil is sort of, he's a school text, he's part of the educational system, and the people who learn Vergil in school, in the universities and in the major public schools, it's really amazing how these people go on to run the world, in a sense.
Yeah.
These people become the prime ministers and the viceroys and the governors general, and they run the foreign office. So the first point to say is that Vergil is fascinating because he's the main school text of the day.
Yeah, and I suppose it's interesting because from what I'm gathering from what you're saying here is that from the moment he was published, he was the main school text in Rome.
Yeah.
He was unbelievably studied in, I'm not sure if you call him a school text, there wasn't sort of a traditional schooling in the Middle Ages. And then you move up into the 18th century and suddenly he's the school text again. So it's this sort of ring composition is the word I'm using it loosely. But it is interesting that this book keeps being brought back to, and it's still on the Leaving Cert syllabus today, I suppose.
So I mean that's a great,
and Latin syllabus actually.
That's a great cause for hope, right? It's for confidence. It's always been around, and it's always been what people study in school. And if you think back to what we were saying about the Aeneid, the political context, so you can imagine if you're a schoolboy in Britain. Now I say schoolboy because of course women are sort of don't have equal access to education in this period, so that's an issue. Classics is has a history of being a male subject, which is not.
Which is changing now, actually.
Which is changing, but which is something you have to deal with. It's not an egalitarian subject. But anyway, if you're a schoolboy in a British public school, you know the map of the British Empire is on the wall and it's covered in red, and you see India and everything, and you read this line in book 1 of the Aeneid that says, "I've given you empire without end." This is what Jupiter says that he'll give to the Romans. There's a line in book 6 of the Aeneid where Aeneas visits the underworld in a sort of very famous book. His father in the underworld gives him this prophecy and says, your job is to war down the proud and to pardon the defeated and to rule the world. So, I mean, if you're looking, and it's a bit sort of annoying, if you're looking for an excuse to rule the world, there it is, you know.
Yeah.
And as I've said, the poem works against that in lots of great ways.
Yeah.
That's what Aeneas is told to do, and then what does he do at the end of book 12? In this great scene, he doesn't have the self-control that he's supposed to have, and
in a very sort of Achilles-like moment.
Exactly. He kills in cold blood this person, this great hero of the poem's final book. So the empire is there. If you wanted to be.
So that's obviously where the 19th century Britain just loves that, because they're trading.
Yeah, so I'd put in a few caveats there, like that's one of the readings. We don't know, you know, if you read Vergil in Victorian England and you don't leave any record of it, we don't know what you think about it. So obviously, you know, this is what Emerson says about Vergil. He says, give me a man reading Vergil, you know, he could have he's not going to think what I think. Another person isn't going to think what I think.
Yeah.
There are as many Vergils as there are readers.
But I think that in itself just shows how great, and I would say the same of Homer. I'm a big Homer fan as well. That the great thing about these epics is that you read and reread them, and they never cease to surprise you. I that's just a sort of a personal digression.
So that's the classic, right? So is what Italo Calvino says, is you're never reading it about this book, you're rereading it. You know? So you can reread it, and you can, you know, you can use it is what you do with all sort of poems you like. You can use it as a help, you know, in your experience to say, give you access to emotions and experiences that you had or you might have in the future. So that's the nice thing about it. It really, And we haven't talked about some of the great moments. So Dido in book 4. Yeah. That's something I would point out. This really, really incredible story, which is so vivid and so real.
And it's so sort of, it's so difficult as well. I think it's very upsetting that Aeneas just sort of... Anyway, I'll let you tell the story. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so on his travels, Aeneas sort of takes refuge with Queen Dido of Carthage, who's building her city, and she very generously takes him in and his men. And when he seems to be happy there, and they fall in love, and then he gets a message from the gods saying, "Get moving! You know, we didn't mean you to hang around Carthage with this woman. You know, we want you to found Italy and go find the Roman race." And again, you know, whose side are you on? This is a question that you can wake up every different week. You can have a different opinion, and throughout history, people have said they've been, you know, pro Dido or pro Aeneas, but it's really one of these great love stories, and it's told with a real subtlety and with a real attention to detail and real beauty that makes it one of these, one of the great stories. And we're told by Macrobius, this guy I mentioned, this sort of late antique commentator, he says, you know, people knew this was a legend, and they knew that this, you know, probably didn't actually happen, but the story was told so well that they didn't care, you know? That they didn't want to think about the facts. They thought, you know, this story is really great, so we're going to believe in Dido.
And Dido is she's a fantastic character, and I suppose the relationship, it's one of those moments, because I do quite like Aeneas as a whole, but there are moments where you sort of question his decision making, and that's in itself I think is quite good because it humanizes him. He's very real. But there is that moment where he just leaves Dido, and he doesn't even offer, "Do you want to come with me?" You know, he doesn't he just says, "No, I've got to go."
But again, this is so typically Vergil. There's this great line where he leaves her crying, wanting to say so much more. This is how Vergil describes Aeneas.
He's compared to an oak, isn't he?
This oak that's been sort of tossed around by these storms, and its roots go down to the underworld, and its branches,
which is a fantastic image, isn't it?
So this sort of stoic image of just relentless sort of self-resolve. He wants to say so much more. So there's another nice line about Vergil which says that often he says things in silence. He says things without saying things. So when you're reading a story like this and you're about to sort of accuse Aeneas of being a complete, idiot. Look at what's being said and look at what's not being said.
Yeah.
There are sort of glances, there are tears falling there.
Yeah.
Aeneas is leaving, he's thinking of his son and he's thinking of what he should do, but he, that's not the full story. So what's not being said is as important as what's being said.
Now, I have to apologise because we've just spent ages talking about the Aeneid.
That's great.
And
I love it. Yeah.
Your area of focus is not on the Aeneid, so I'm going to give the reins back to you if you like, and we're going to bring it back to the Georgics in the 19th century. And I suppose, why are the Georgics an important text in this era?
So that's my theory, and I suppose I have to spend a bit of time proving it and convincing everybody. So it's a very well studied text, as I've said. People know about it, people read it in school, and the people who read it in school often end up having lots of influence in the world. It's a poem about landscape, okay? It's a poem about land, how you use land, and if you think about it, that's a very resonant topic in any era, but particularly in this era, okay? We're talking about the British Empire, we're talking about the way that British society, especially in the last, in the 19th, 20th century, it idealizes, Britain, British landscape, native land, back to Shakespeare and even further back. So I suppose what I mean is that this theme is sort of pretty resonant. And that was my hunch. What first kicked me off onto it was that all the Victorians, they really love the Georgics. They say this is the most perfect poem in Latin. So the Aeneid is magnificent, and it goes further, and it's sort of larger than the Georgics. But if you want a sort of a technically perfect, well-judged, immaculate poem, this is what you go for.
Yeah.
So there's an aesthetic tradition there which says this is really, really great. And I said, well, that's interesting. And why is that the case? And then, is there maybe another angle you could take, which is a sort of a more political angle? So, yes, it's a great poem, but what sort of context is the poem being talked about? And I just sort of looked up old newspaper archives and stuff like that, and you find interesting things. So you find things like in 1865 in Britain, there's a cattle plague.
Yeah.
A good few years now ago, there was a foot and mouth crisis in Ireland when I was in primary school. The same sort of thing. There's a disease of animals, and the animals have to be slaughtered in large numbers. People write into the papers, and Benjamin Disraeli, soon to be Prime Minister, gives this speech that's reported in the paper. And what do they say that this plague is like? It's exactly like Vergil.
Yeah.
So over a span of 19 centuries, they're not talking about contemporary science. They're talking about this is exactly like the plague in the end of.
And I've seen, even to make things a bit more compared to what's going on today, I've seen countless articles comparing the Aeneid to the refugee crisis, this idea of people who have been forced by war to flee their land and have been left. So it is just has these universal themes.
Yeah, and also that's true, exile as a theme in the Aeneid. It comes up in sort of other very interesting contexts, and from an Irish perspective, this is quite intriguing, in terms of Irish land in the 19th century, okay?
Yeah.
In terms of the famine, in terms of Isaac Butt, who is the founder of the Irish Home Rule Party, who starts the movement that Parnell will bring on at the end of the 19th century. There are people in the House of Lords, the House of Commons in England, and Ireland is being discussed, the famine, the ravages of the famine, and these British MPs, they quote the Georgics, and particularly they quote this line that says, Vergil, there's a famous set piece at the end of the Georgics, Book 2, which is a praise of Italy, and he says, farmers, you're so happy, if only you knew how good your life is, And this is what they quote in the House of Commons. So this is something that they would have learned in school, and they say, Ireland, I've always thought that the Irish don't know how good they have it. Ireland is we don't tax Ireland very well, and it's very fertile, so what are they complaining about? And I'm simplifying, but the point is that they quote Vergil. So they say, happy farmers, they quote these two lines from the end of the book poem. So that sort of thing, that's sort of very interesting, and it's very political, right?
Yeah.
So this is a poem which is being used to, condescend to a very real humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting because it's sort of the polar opposite from the set view of this passage, which is that this is a very lovely praise of country life, which it is. But then it's not so simple. And then the sort of my plan is to use these sort of political insights to to feed back into how we read the poem itself, and to see, can we, these things we read about a poem in a particular context, can they change how we feel about the Georgics itself?
Now, moving on a little bit from sort of the 18th century to the early 19th century, how does Vergil relate to the First World War period in Britain, and how is it received? Can you...
Yeah, so I'm still sort of quantifying that, but the same context applies. So the social context is that Vergil is a school text, and a lot of people read Vergil, and a lot of people are influenced by him. So that comes out in a number of different ways. People, when the war is declared in 1914, people write into the Times with quotes from Vergil, and they say, you know, I fear the Greeks. You know, they quote the war. They quote from Book 2 of the Aeneid and say, you know, poems about war and treachery and lines like that. There's one particular soldier who's a classical scholar, and he writes all these letters home. He's killed in action. His name is Stephen Hewitt in 1918. Yeah. And he quotes the text he's read in school from the trenches. So he quotes again the war scenes from Book 2 of the Aeneid, when he's in the trenches in Flanders. And I don't want to sort of overestimate how it's not the case that, you know, everybody in the war was talking about Vergil. You know, this is a very specific context. You have to have had a certain level of education, and that implies a certain social
there's a
class.
There's a chance that most of the officers in the trenches probably knew about Vergil, but maybe not
exactly.
Soldiers.
But there's also an equally good chance that most soldiers didn't have anything to do with him, and that's something that I think is important. That I don't want to say that, you know, it's perfectly fine and proper that that's the case. And then, you know, after the war, people are wondering about, or looking around and saying, you know, where do we go from here? The people who are involved in classics in Britain, they say, you know, they take inspiration from the Aeneid, saying, you know, we got to keep working, we got to keep moving. That's a very sort of simple reaction. In 1926. A poet called Vita Sackville-West publishes a poem called The Land, which is openly inspired and quotes Vergil, and it's a bestseller. She wins a prize for it in it. So I'm still sort of quantifying it, but in lots of different ways, Vergil is still there. He's a source of solace. So he says, you know, we can get through this. It's a war poem, right? So it's sort of it comes back in interesting ways, and that goes right through the 20th century. Through the Second World War, there's British poets like Sidney Keys in the Second World War who write poems. Sidney Keys has a poem about Dido, so he sort of takes aim at Aeneas for leaving Dido in Carthage. He's fighting in North Africa in 1942, so he's actually in the place where the poem is set, because Dido is represented as living in Carthage in Tunisia. And then right into the Cold War, you know, exile again is a big theme. And right through to, you know, people. There's a Polish poet called Czesław Miłosz who writes about Orpheus and Eurydice. So that's the Georgics there coming in at the end of the early 21st century. So basically when war is an issue, and when exile and war and death are themes, people who read Vergil will sort of cotton onto these things. Yeah,
I suppose, just sort of coming to the end, including things a little bit, I'm going to ask you probably what's going to be a very difficult question. I know if I was asked it, I wouldn't be able to answer it. In the Georgics and the Aeneid, what are your favourite books? Or what are your favourite scenes, even, if you don't want to quite...
Yeah, so the Georgics has 4 great set pieces at the end of each of its books. There's a war at the end of the first book. There is the Italian countryside at the end of the second book. There is a plague at the end of the third book. And then I think there are so many great bits in the Georgics. I love the weather signs and the astrology in book 1, and I love lots of different bits. But this story of Orpheus, it comes at the end. It's sort of a famous story of this poet whose wife dies, and he goes into the underworld to get her back. He's a famous musician, so he charms sort of the souls of the underworld to let him in. He gets her back, and he's coming out of the underworld, and the one thing he was told is, look, you can have her, but if you look back at her, it's gone, it's over, the deal's off. And he looks back. His wife is lost again, and he it's in the context of a sort of a story Vergil is telling, which is magical in itself, about this farmer Aristeus who needs to get his bees back. But this is the one part of the Georgics which has huge influence in this entire tradition. I mentioned that Miłosz poem, which I really, really like. Rilke in German is influenced by this story. Arcade Fire, if anyone knows of Arcade Fire.
More contemporary.
Their album Reflector has these two songs, which I think are pretty cool. One about Orpheus and one about Eurydice. So in terms
of...
of...
look that up now.
Yeah.
Again, I'll put links to those in the description.
I recommend. So this story of Orpheus is really hard to beat at the end of the fourth book of the Georgics. And it's not something you expect in a farming poem, right? So it's another example of being surprised. In terms of Vergil, there are two characters, I think, who are my favourites, if I can say that. There is Dido, who we've talked about, and then there is Turnus, this anti-hero who is... Really, we find ourselves being really sympathetic to.
He gets compared to Achilles a lot, doesn't he? Cause
and he, if you look at it a certain way, he is trying to live his life, and this guy comes from Italy and starts, steals his wife and starts making war on him, and he's a great character, and he probably doesn't get a lot of press because he has to compete with Dido, but he is one of the great characters of the poem, and particularly in Book 12 when he is faced with this impossible task. This Aeneas is backed by heaven, and he knows he's not going to win, and he has massive bravery in standing up to Aeneas and facing his own death in a very brave way. So I suppose for the Aeneid, I just say those two characters I think are my favourite.
Yeah, and I suppose now to conclude, I'm going to ask you the question that everyone always finds either really difficult or really hates.
Yeah.
If I could only take away 3 things about Vergil from this podcast, what would those 3 things be?
Okay, good question. So the first thing is that you should read him, and anyone who's listening should read him, because I think he's great, and I think you'll enjoy
I'm behind that one.
2 is that he has this profound empathy for characters. So it's really great. If you're reading a character in Vergil, you're gonna take a view, you're gonna feel things, there are all different sort of shades of his characters. So he's a great poet for empathy. And then the third thing is that it's not when you read Vergil, you don't just read Vergil, you enter into this massive long tradition which people love and hate in equal measure. You read Vergil, that means you have a foothold in Dante, that means you have a foothold in even someone like Seamus Heaney, who's influenced by Vergil. You're reading about the history of education, about what is called, quote unquote, the Western tradition. So you get a 2-for-1 deal. You get Vergil, and then you get everything that goes with him. So those are my 3 things, I think.
Those are your 3 things. Well, brilliant. That brings us nicely to the end of the podcast. Charlie, thank you so much for joining me. It really has been a pleasure, and giving us a fantastic overview of the life and work of Vergil, and of course the very best of luck with the rest of your thesis.
Thanks,
I'm sure we won't have heard the last of you. If you enjoyed today's podcast and want to find out more or get involved with Classical Youth Society of Ireland, you can contact us via our social media pages on facebook.com/Classical Youth Society Ireland, Twitter @CYSI_, or for any direct inquiries you can email us cysiofficial@gmail.com. Today's podcast was produced by myself and edited by Michael Fuller. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you all next time.